Hey, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library. I'm Garrett Gunderson, Supervisory Archivist here at the library. We're glad to have you with us in person and via live stream this evening for our first program of the fall season, so we're quite excited about that. Before we get started, we of course have a few housekeeping chores we have to check off. So first, please silence or turn off all of your cell phones. I double check mine. During the Q&A session, if you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to be passed to you before asking your question. That way, everyone in the auditorium and online can hear your question. And for our online audience, we should have an email option available for submitting questions. Following the program, we will have a book signing and also books for sale. And I'll also take a moment to kind of preview our upcoming programs for the remainder of the fall season. On October 7th, Kathleen Kornerens will be here to speak about her experience as a member of the first class at the U.S. Air Force Academy to include female cadets. And October 30th, we'll be hosting Mark Updegrove, author of Make Your Mark, Lessons in Character from 7 Presidents. And on November 19th, Catherine Kramer Brownwell will be here to talk on the Entertainer-in-Chief, how popular culture has remade the presidency. So that should be a lot of fun. Information about these programs are available on our website at fordlibrarymuseum.gov, and we also have flyers available in our lobby. Before we start our program, we actually have a special guest with us, Lou Paletta, who is Chief Volunteer Coordinator for the Greatest Generation Committee in Grand Rapids, who will now share some comments about the work of the committee. Lou?
So hi, we'd like to thank all of you for coming today and tell you a little bit about the committee. There's about 15 or 20 of us that have been working, some for 5 years, most of us just for 1 year, to make this whole week's celebration going on. This is event number 4 of the 10 main events that we are having for the Greatest Generation. Yesterday we kicked off with 1 and 2 with a parade. In a second, Tara's going to show you a brief video on that. We had a beautiful day in Grand Rapids. We had 33 living members of the Greatest Generation between 97 and a half and 102 that were in the parade. We honored 77 people who bought what we called were tribute boards. This is the one that we made for President Ford, and it will be, you'll see video of people marching, and this will be here in the lobby. We had 24 vintage cars, and up here in front we have Ed and Sue who showed their car. They're also going to be showing their car at the Gerald Ford Museum. On Thursday, it was a car that was used by General Eisenhower. We had an airplane from the Air Zoo, a Wildcat. We had various people just wanted to come and march, and it was a great event. We have today with Garrett, he's speaking tomorrow in Grand Rapids. On Thursday, we have Susan Eisenhower going to be speaking. And then on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, we have a free film festival in Grand Rapids. So if you have nothing to do and no football at home, I don't know, is it football at home this weekend? If you want to go to Grand Rapids, but we do thank you. I mean, the whole purpose is to honor these members of the Greatest Generation, and I know Garrett's going to talk about that, but we thank you for being here.
Thank you, Lou, and thank you for your efforts on behalf of the Greatest Generation. It's now my privilege to introduce and welcome back Garrett Graff to the Ford Library. He's been a good friend of the library for many years now. He's a best-selling journalist and Pulitzer Prize finalist historian who has covered politics, technology, and national security for 2 decades. The former editor of Political Magazine, he writes the popular Doomsday Scenario newsletter and hosts the Edward R. Murrow award-winning podcast, Long Shadow. He's the author of 10 books, including Watergate, A New History, but he's also best known for his landmark volumes of oral histories, including The Only Plane in the Sky, an oral history on 9/11, When the Sea Came Alive, an oral history of D-Day, and most recently, The Devil Reached Toward the Sky, the making and unleashing of the atomic bomb. This evening, Garrett Graff joins Ford Library and Museum Director Brooke Clement on stage for a discussion on the legacy of the greatest generation, how World War II changed the world, and the first-person realities of fighting in the greatest conflict humanity has ever known. Please join me in welcoming Brooke Clement and Garrett Graff to the Ford Library stage.
All right. Well, it's great to have such a great crowd for our first program back this fall, and it's especially great to have Garrett back as well. So we just want to kick things off, get the party started with a quick question here. You have authored several oral histories, with this work serving as a near bookend to your previous one on D-Day. What aspects of this storytelling methodology consistently draw you to it?
So thank you for having me back. It's a pleasure to be here. I guess I am not surprised I'm the first of the fall season since it's only September 1st. I would be surprised if you had crammed in any events before this one. So oral history for me is, I think, a particularly important style and tradition of history. For those of you who don't know it or haven't read one of my books or another oral history, it's all in the first person. So it's done in the words of the people who lived these moments. And to me, what I think oral history is particularly powerful at capturing is the messiness of what it is like to live events not knowing the outcome. That often when we write narrative history, and I've written plenty of narrative history and enjoy it, we have a tendency in teaching history to make it seem neater, cleaner, simpler, and more preordained than it felt to anyone at the time. Look at the moment that we are living through right now. None of us know the outcome of the story that we are living through right now. And so in my book on 9/11, in my book on D-Day, and this book on the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb, I think telling those stories, which are so well known, I mean, anyone who is picking up any of those books knows the outcome of the book. Like these are not books that you're kept in suspense about what actually is going to happen on June 6th. But what I try to do in the voices of the people who lived them is capture what they felt and experienced at a moment when they didn't know the outcome. And so, we look back on D-Day as this enormous, triumphant victory. When you go back and you read the letters that the young men in the landing ships crossing the English Channel on the night of June 5th, or the paratroopers as they are flying across to parachute into the Norman hedgerows on the night of June 5th, they don't know that they are going to be part of something that is a world historic triumph. They're scared, they're lonely, they don't know what the next day is going to bring for them. They don't know whether they're going to have what it takes to live up to being in combat, whether they're going to let down their friends, whether they're going to survive. And of course, there are some 6,000 on that D-Day who don't make it to the end of that next day. And so, I was able to pull some letters actually in that D-Day book from people who don't live through, but who wrote down their thoughts and their memories of crossing on those ships on the night of June 5th. And I think you see that especially true in the story of the Manhattan Project, which so immediately associate the atomic bomb with the war in Japan, with the war in the Pacific. You know, here we are tonight, September 2nd, the 80th anniversary of the final surrender ceremonies aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The story of the Manhattan bomb is mostly the story of the war in Europe. It is mostly the story of the ragtag physicists, mostly Jewish refugees, fleeing the enveloping cloak of Hitler's fascism in Europe, coming to the United States, and then sort of knocking on every door that they can in 1939, 1940, and 1941, trying to convince the US government and the US military, hey, we've discovered this thing called nuclear fission. We think it could lead to a really big bomb. We know Werner Heisenberg. We've worked with Werner Heisenberg. We know he's at work on this back in Germany for Hitler. We don't want Hitler to get the bomb first. And so they feel for most of the war that they are in this incredibly intense race to beat Hitler at the bomb. I have this quote in the book, as in 1942 in the University of Chicago, where they are building the first nuclear chain reactor in the old squash court underneath the football stadium at the University of Chicago, which if any of you are involved in the University of Michigan here, you know that's not where a university risk professional would locate the world's first nuclear reactor in modern day times. And they have this, one of the guys tells a story about one of the physicists who comes in early. They've got 2 shifts that they're running 80 hours, 90 hours a week through the fall of 1942. And one of the physicists comes in early for his shift, and he says, you know, I feel that somewhere in Europe, Hitler's at work on his bomb, and if Hitler's at work, I should be at work too. And so he sort of comes in for that extra shift that day just because he feels under such pressure to beat Hitler at building this bomb. And so to sort of tell these stories at a moment in the perspective of embarking upon the Manhattan Project, you know, they don't know who's going to win World War II. They don't know whether Hitler's going to get the bomb first. They don't know whether an atom bomb is even going to work. And trying to understand that historical perspective, I think, is something that comes through in oral history in a way that is really, really hard to capture when you're reading narrative history.
Yeah, exactly. And as you're saying this, it's also drawing upon the fact that, like, as I read the book, there were so many voices of the greatest generation, not just the people that were fighting the fight in either the Pacific or in Europe. You had scientists, you had young women, you had food service personnel, you had custodians. So where did you want us to go from there with all of these contributions, and why did you select these particular ones?
Yeah, so this to me, I think was actually like the incredible part of the Manhattan Project story, that we, I think, very often oversimplify the story of the Manhattan Project to J. Robert Oppenheimer and his band of merry physicists on a mesa in Los Alamos. Oppenheimer was a terrific movie. I actually came away from this research impressed at how historically accurate it actually was. But the majesty of the Manhattan Project is in the industrial might that the United States is able to bring to bear on the building of the atomic bomb. So I think we so often tell, and this is in talking with Lou about this week's events, I think this is one of the great things that they did in the parade yesterday, was honor the people who worked on the home front here as part of that war effort. That we spend so much time in World War II history talking about where the battles were fought. You know, Bastogne and Omaha Beach and El Alamein and Leyte Gulf and Guadalcanal and Okinawa. But World War II was won here in the United States. And it was won in the bomber factories of the Ford Motor Company at Willow Run. It was won in the synthetic rubber factories in Ohio. It was won in the shipyards and landing craft factories of Higgins Industry in New Orleans. And it was won in the secret cities that we built in Hanford, Washington, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee, for the Manhattan Project. These are facilities that it's almost impossible to capture the scope of. These were remote mountain valleys in Tennessee, a desert in eastern Washington state, where the US government went in and seized hundreds of thousands of acres of land. The facilities are like 50 miles wide by 50 miles long. The factories are multiple football fields large. The Oak Ridge, Tennessee, one of the uranium processing facilities there, is the largest roofed building in the world on the day that it is completed. These two cities in Hanford, Washington, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, employ and house 100,000 people apiece by the summer of 1945 in communities that were created entirely from scratch in the war. Of the 100,000 people at Oak Ridge, 50 of them know what the facility actually does and what the project actually is working towards. The bus system in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, on August 6, 1945, the day the Manhattan Project is announced to the world, is one of the 10 largest public transit systems in the United States. And it serves a city that is not publicly acknowledged, doesn't appear on any map, and no one knows exists. And the stories of these workforces are incredible. The facility at Oak Ridge, so the Hanford, Washington plant is primarily plutonium. The Oak Ridge, Tennessee plant is mostly uranium. The uranium is refined in these machines called calutrons, which we build thousands of them to operate. Tennessee Eastman, division of Eastman Kodak, is brought in to actually run the factories and the facilities because the US government is like, we have no idea how to run massive 100,000 person factories. You know, Eastman come in and do it. And Eastman, this is 43, 44, they're looking around, all the men are off to war, and the labor force that they are able to bring together are high school educated girls fresh out of school in Tennessee. The Berkeley physicists who are working on setting up these calutrons are like, there's no way we can teach a high school girl how to run a calutron. You know, we're PhD nuclear physicists. And then so Tennessee Eastman sets up a head-to-head competition between these calutron operators. They end up coming to be called the Calutron Girls, and the Berkeley PhDs. And it turns out that the Calutron Girls actually outperform the Berkeley PhDs in actually processing the uranium. And they work for the year straight, 24 hours a day in these facilities. Most of them learn the word uranium for the first time on August 6, 1945. They never actually know what the thing is that comes out the other side of these machines that they work on in the mountains of Oak Ridge, Tennessee.
Go girls. So we're sitting in a presidential library, which is part of the National Archives and Records Administration, and there is quite a bit actually at the Chicago Archives that deals with the University of Chicago's part in this. They even have the Chianti bottle that you reference in the book. So just kind of looking at your research for the book, how did that all come about?
Yeah. So this was so the book. Both of these books, actually, the D-Day one and the Manhattan Project book, are entirely archival. They are entirely reliant on the generosity of archivists and librarians across the country. I'll talk a little bit about the way that this one came together. The D-Day book was heavily reliant on the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, who has this incredible archive of oral histories of World War II veterans. This one was a mix of memoirs and actually a fair number of Nobel Prize lectures, which is not a primary source I have dealt with a lot before.
Interesting.
And then the Oak Ridge Public Library actually has done this incredible oral history project, video and audio interviews with Oak Ridge workers. There, I used archives in Japan to tell the story of the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You know, oral history is sort of an interesting art. It is the opposite of normal writing. It is entirely subtractive, not additive. And so what I do is, for these books is, you know, I'll spend 6 to 9 months gathering the material, doing the research, digging through the archives, collecting sort of every single possible quote that I might be interested in, and then sit down with this file that in both cases was about 1.4 million words. That's about 4,000 pages. And then I'm a Vermonter, and so I talk about it as it's like making maple syrup, that you just sit there and boil slowly for a really, really long time until you've boiled off everything but the finished maple syrup. And so, you know, for me, it's you ending up cutting about 95% of the book to get down to sort of the core of the story. This is about 500 voices. The D-Day book is about 700 voices. It's every single thing from, you know, full-length memoirs to, you know, single quotes from soldiers and, you know, passing by a war correspondent in the field. For this one, actually, a hugely useful document was the 1,000-page transcript of the Oppenheimer hearing that was the Atomic Energy Commission security clearance hearing that sort of forms the narrative backbone of the Oppenheimer movie, because it's Oppenheimer himself actually leaves us very little in his own words about the project. And so one of the only places that you really find him talking about it is in that AEC hearing.
So getting back to the military strategy behind the bomb, it seems as though there was always a consistent thought that there would be a need to drop both bombs. What was the rationale behind that decision? Was it always presumed that Japan wasn't going to capitulate? Like, explain that.
This is probably the most complex part of the whole book, because this question, the way that we frame this question now is sort of, were the atomic bombs necessary? You know, did we have to drop the bomb? Did we have to drop the second one? You know, could we have beaten Japan without it? And that's not really, again, this is, I think, part of the strength of the oral history format. That's not really the way that anyone looked at this question in 1945. I talked about how so much of this war, or so much of the bomb story is about the war in Europe. There's a big chunk of the scientists who are working on this who are pissed that they're too late, that they built this bomb to drop it on Berlin. And the original timeline for the bomb was it was going to be ready in 44. And, gosh, just imagine if we'd been able to drop that bomb in October 44. We never would have had the Battle of the Bulge. We never would have had those last 6 months of the war in Europe. Many of them sort of say, look, we got into this to beat Hitler. We've beaten Hitler. Hitler doesn't have the bomb. We don't need to drop it on Japan now. We can win this war through conventional means. There are a fair number of the scientists, though, who also, you have to think back to what World War II was. This was a war where your whole family was working in this war in some way or another. And so for a lot of them, they can name their family members who are alive today because they invented the atomic bomb. Leona Woods, I quote in the book, one of the few women who's at the core of the Manhattan Project team. She talks about how her brother was a Marine flamethrower in Okinawa who would have been on the second wave of the invasion of Japan in the fall of 45. And her brother is alive today, she believes, because she invented the atomic bomb. And that this is something that I think we sort of misunderstand the moral context that a lot of the U.S. policymakers come to this final decision in the summer of 45, because we're looking at the atomic bomb as if it was something different. And summer of 45, there's 60 million people who have been killed in World War II. 15 million combatants, 45 million civilians. That's a number that is so large that we still round off the total number of Chinese dead to the closest 5 million, because we just don't really know. Through the spring and summer of 45, the U.S. is firebombing the Japanese cities. The single deadliest day of World War II, the single deadliest day of human conflict, is not the atomic bomb. It's the Operation Meeting House firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945, where in a single incendiary raid, we burn 100,000 Japanese in a single night. From there, we go on to firebomb 66 other Japanese cities and towns. Every other night, every third night through the summer, we're sending out 100 to 300 bombers to firebomb these cities. So many, so thoroughly, that they actually have to save Hiroshima and Nagasaki and a handful of other cities for the atomic bomb, and come up with this list of the cities we're going to set aside to hit with the atomic bomb. Because if we firebomb these cities first, there's not going to be enough of the city left for us to drop the atomic bomb on them. And so by the summer of 45, we have killed so many people across this war in so many ways, and not just we, the United States, but the whole world. The Japanese use biological weapons in China that cholera, bubonic plague, typhoid fever, that kill 300,000 Chinese in biological warfare. World War II, we've just sort of killed people in every conceivable possible way. We have, by that spring, the 6 million Jewish dead in the Holocaust. coming, sort of the U.S. just beginning to understand the scope and scale of that. And that in Japan, we are, the naval blockade that we have set up that is starving Japan. The summer of 45, their rice crop collapses. They are on track for a famine that is killing 200,000 civilians a month, in addition to the firebombing, in addition to the combat. This is a war of just tremendous toll. And the atomic bomb is seen as just sort of the next stage of that. And that it's not that we saw it as drop the bomb or not. It was, we thought we were going to have to drop the bomb and also have the Soviet Union invade and also have the naval blockade and also invade ourselves. Like, we thought this war was going on for another year. We had a plan for dropping 9 more atomic bombs on Japan just to support the initial phases of the invasion. That there were going to be 3 main invasion beaches. Each invasion beach was going to get 3 atomic bombs to drop on Japan, sort of around those beaches, just to push back Japan enough that we could get our landing crews in.
That's amazing. You also talk about, or you also integrate the narratives of the Hayabusa, which were the survivors. I had never heard that there were actually survivors of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki together. Like, I thought that was profoundly moving. I can only imagine the nature of your research process and uncovering those moments, and just if you would discuss how that came to be.
Yeah. So this is, again, part of the story that I think lose a little bit of this in the narrative history that it comes through in the oral history, which is, we know that we dropped an atomic bomb on Japan on August 6th in Hiroshima, August 9th in Nagasaki. The Japanese didn't know that. There was no one in Hiroshima who had heard of an atomic bomb on the day that the bomb was dropped on their city. And so a big part of their story, of the survivors, is not just the horror of the bomb, but it's then them digging themselves out of the rubble and trying to make sense of what has happened to their city. That they don't have any understanding of how a single bomb could do this level of damage, to create a hurricane strength firestorm that burns their entire city to the ground. And I think you talk about there are about 400 people who survive Hiroshima and go home to Nagasaki on August 7th and 8th, and then are in place in Nagasaki on the morning of the 9th when the second bomb falls there. About 150 of them, very hard to know the exact numbers, but about 150 of them actually end up surviving both bombings. And they come to be known as the twice bombed people. And, they actually have some of the only knowledge. What I found so striking about their testimonies and memories and oral histories is they're the only ones on August 9th who know what's happening when the bomb hits. And they have these memories of, I'm standing there. One of them's a worker for the Mitsubishi shipyards. And, he's standing there in his office telling his boss about this crazy thing that happened to him in Hiroshima on August 6th. And he sees the flash of the second bomb at 11:02 on the morning of the 9th. And like, I knew that flash. That was the flash. And so he's actually able to get under a desk that second time, and live. But to me, those were like the really powerful stories. Is like I think I quote 4 or 5 of them in the book. But they're the ones on August 9th who recognize what is about to actually happen to Nagasaki in that split second.
Yeah, it was generally very difficult to read that piece, but it was very worthwhile to know about it as well. So what was the most surprising revelation to you while you wrote this book?
I think to me, the most surprising part of it was the scale and scope of the Manhattan Project, which I talked about. And that just the sheer scale of these efforts, the incredible levels of science that we had to bring to bear, and the industrial might that then we translated that to. I mean, they are. The audacity of what these scientists are doing. They are at the start of the Manhattan Project in '42. They are building factories to manufacture plutonium at a scale of kilograms, at a time when plutonium has never been visible to the naked eye. It exists only in literal microscopic amounts at the start of the Manhattan Project.
All right, well, I have one last question, and then we're gonna open it up to audience questions. But my last question is, tell us about the title, "The Devil Reached Toward the Sky," where that came from.
So the Devil Reached Toward the Sky is a quote from Paul Numeroff, who is one of the technicians at Los Alamos, and he does not go to the Trinity test, the first atomic test on July 16th, 1945 in Alamogordo, New Mexico, but he's in his lab when coworkers come back from the test site to tell him about it. And one of them described witnessing that first atomic explosion as the devil reached up toward the sky to pull the heavens down, which I just thought was an incredibly evocative quote and description of what it must have been like to watch that first atomic explosion.
Thank you, Garrett. And we are going to start with some audience questions. Just a reminder, please wait until you have a microphone in hand, because we want the people on our live stream to be able to hear your question too.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Claire Dahl. Lou, hello. And I have done 28 original Rosies, the interviews for 28 originals. I just finished one this weekend for a 107-year-old Rosie in Chelsea, Michigan. And their stories are incredible. As you said, when they are talking about the fact that these are the girlfriends, the sisters, the wives, the mothers and grandmothers of our servicemen who took jobs and they didn't think they were qualified for them. These jobs scared the hell out of them. What could they do to get on with the rest of their life? It's incredible. And so we do have them as part of the Veterans History Project to get another whole series of this. And I'm hoping that in all the books that you do, you include more of the stories of the Rosies. You know, they all in their interviews never say, I don't consider myself a hero. I just did what I had to do to bring my son home. And yet we sometimes only celebrate the military, like on those important patriotic concerts we have, and we play the military anthems, and we have the sailors stand up and the army and this and that. We never play the great Rosie song, because these are the people who supported the military and allowed them to do what they did. But thank you for what you do, but please add some Rosies.
Yeah.
or contact me. I have them.
Yeah.
I've got
I'll tell you sort of one other funny story from this book about the contributions of women in the home front in the war. So the pilot of the Enola Gay is someone we all sort of know, Paul Tibbets. And Paul Tibbets was not just some random B-29 pilot who happened to be the next guy on the duty roster on Tinian in the Marianas Islands on August 6th. He actually turns out to be arguably perhaps the best bomber pilot in World War II. And he has this hugely successful bomber career in Europe, then comes back to the United States to help set up the training program for the B-29, which is the super fortress that's going to be the bomber that we use to attack Japan. It has this incredible 1,500-mile range, so we can bomb from the Marianas Islands, attack the home islands. And it's a new plane. And so it's got a lot of gremlins, and the engines don't really work, and the men in the pilots in the sort of first units assigned to the B-29 don't want to fly this thing. They think it's too hard of a plane to fly. So Paul Tibbets goes down, I think it's to Georgia, I forget, somewhere down south, and picks up two WASPs, the women air service pilots who sort of help fly planes domestically here in the United States. It's technically a civilian role, even though it's a part of the military system. And he spends 3 days teaching these two women to fly the B-29, and then has them fly across the country to each B-29 base. And the plane lands, and these two women get out of the cockpit, and instantly there is not a man on the base anymore who is too embarrassed to fly the B-29. And so in the space of a week, Paul Tibbets is able to turn around the entire B-29 training program, because there's suddenly no male pilot in the U.S. the Army Air Service at the time is willing to say, I refuse to fly that plane. So then from there, he's pulled into the Manhattan Project and asked to set up the 509th Bomb Composite Group that becomes the bomber unit that goes off to fly the B-29.
And I say, go girls.
To me, a common theme in both books is just cooperation. D-Day, the cooperation between the services of different countries. And I was especially intrigued in the Manhattan book about the scientists, especially early in the book, different universities, different strategies. They share successes and failures. They get the help from the government that they need, which leads to a question based upon the op-ed you did in the New York Times last month, where you say the greatest gift of the Manhattan Project wasn't the bomb, but a new way of looking at how science and government can work together. However, as you know, you start the sentence by saying, what America may find is that we have squandered the greatest gift of the Manhattan Project. Do you have any hope of that kind of cooperation happening again now, or what would be an event, a situation that would cause that level of cooperation?
Yeah, so the first big chunk of the book is about this group of scientists coming together to really convince the U.S. military and the government that a bomb is worth building. The U.S. government, the U.S. military, does not in 1940 view science and technology as a core national strength of the United States. And so it's these scientists literally knocking on doors in the military and saying, we should build this bomb. The military is saying, we don't want anything to do with this. And it's only actually on Saturday, December 6th, 1941, that the US launches the official project that will come to be known as the Manhattan Project, day before Pearl Harbor. And by the end of the war, the Manhattan Project, along with efforts at the MIT Rad Lab to build radar and the proximity fuse and other efforts, have created this whole new model for how science and government can work together. And I believe, and I argue, that that's the model that delivers us the half century of economic innovation and sort of superpower hegemony that the US enjoys after World War II, is that vision for higher education, working with government support on science and medicine and technology. The National Science Foundation grows out of that. DARPA grows out of it to a certain extent also. And I do really worry that we are watching that model unwind right now at a specific moment where we are about to embark on an era of technology in AI that I think could be just as transformative as the Manhattan Project was. And I worry a great deal that that future is going to get invented elsewhere and not here. And what that means for the United States, who we don't remember a time when the future was invented elsewhere. And I think we forget at our peril the power and strength that being the place where the whole rest of the world wants to come to invent the future has given us over the last 80 years.
Hi, I'm an avid reader of Doomsday Scenario, love it. And I'm wondering, and if people haven't checked it out, I hope you do. I'm wondering if your experiences writing these oral history books are allowing you to see today in a little bit different way than if you had only done narrative history books.
Yeah, it's a great question, and thank you for reading. I think I think we all underestimate how different the future can be. That I think one of the challenges of narrative history or sort of our life experience is that we imagine that the future looks more like the past than it has to. And I think we are living in a moment where the standard deviation of what our future looks like is a lot bigger than I thought it was going to be a couple of years ago. And I worry a great deal that I think in this present moment, one of the things I've sort of talked about over the course of the spring is that, and this comes back to some of the question about what's happening in higher ed and elsewhere, that I have lost sight of where the future leads us in a way that, as the parent of two young kids, I don't know the world that they are going to grow up in now in a way that 5 years ago I would have told you I did understand the world that they were going to grow up
My question is, okay, how's this? And my understanding is that some subjects, when giving oral histories, aren't and have for decades not been forthcoming with their stories, maybe even to some who are closest to them. So my question is a how and a why. How do you go about extracting some of these incredible and amazing stories, whether it's through the lens of your most recent book or some other written work of yours? And why is it that those individuals maybe not so much have been guarded with respect to their stories, but why is it that they then get to a point that they are forthcoming? So again, kind of an oral history.
Yeah. So I think there are a couple of different things to unpack from that question. One is, I did my Watergate book as a narrative history, because there's no way you could do a oral history of Watergate, because no one told the truth about what any of them did. I sort of talked about, the challenge of that book from a historian's perspective is there are about 36 core memoirs of Watergate, all of whom are convicted of perjury or obstruction of justice. And so not very reliable narrators of their own story. And you sort of struggle with that, I think, in oral history, because memory is imperfect, and traumatic memory especially so. And that I think part of what I find useful is places where there are grand stages, and so you have thousands that you can draw upon. So you can pick the best of this scene or that scene, depending on who's in the room and what took place and who has the best memory and where it gets recorded. Probably a lot of you in this room have parents who were in the Greatest Generation. They didn't like to talk about their time in the war. And it was only very late in relative terms in the sort of 70s and 80s that a lot of those stories began to get collected. But it was at this moment when, as a nation, we really began to recognize the service and sacrifice of that generation. One of the things that I worry about right now is that I fear that we have lost, in just the last couple of years, the chance to do that with the Vietnam generation. That we did not have a similar moment where that generation sort of felt that they should write their stories down or tell their stories or record their stories. And I've done, not a book, but I've done some magazine writing on Vietnam. And I would do these incredible interviews with folks who told me things that they never told their children about their time in Vietnam. And I've sort of had some conversations with my book editor about, I think we're about 10 years too late to do a, Vietnam oral history, because there's just not quite enough of that generation who felt that they had the permission and the energy to sit down and tell those stories.
Your discussion of the Manhattan Project makes me all the more. Obviously, once we'd done it, people knew you could do it. But Oak Ridge, North Korea, how did a lot less effort.
So the question is sort of the nuclear proliferation, how it happens. You know, the Soviet Union was able to do it very quickly, in part because of the sort of Soviet Union had a pretty good espionage network in the Manhattan Project to funnel some of those secrets back, including Klaus Fuchs, who I talk about in the book a bunch, who was sort of the primary atomic spy for Russia in the Manhattan Project, and was actually a great contributor to the Manhattan Project. I mean, sort of part of it is he was pretty vital to the effort. He just took it all out the back door as well. And in the years since, of course, you know, we've seen now 9 countries go on to develop nuclear weapons. The technology is not that hard once it's proven. I mean, this was sort of the core of the Manhattan Project, was once you knew it was possible, that was sort of the whole mystery. And so that was what they thought would launch Adolf Hitler on the bomb quest himself. You know, I think one of the things I've been talking about in the book tour is we are at a moment now where 80 years later, I think we are closer to the edge of nuclear danger than most people realize on a day-to-day basis. That you know, we've already seen this year India and Pakistan, the 2 largest nuclear arsenals to ever come into open conflict, fight a war. We've seen the US and Israeli raids on the Iranian nuclear program. And the US geopolitical instability is leading to new conversations about nuclear proliferation in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, including in countries like Germany, that are thinking about whether they need to develop their own nuclear arsenals. And I think over the next decade, I think we're likely to see that number of 9 nuclear nations actually go up in a way that 15 years ago we thought we were on a path towards nuclear abolition. And I think we are, anyone who studies nuclear war can tell you that we have escaped nuclear war much more through luck than by skill, diplomacy, or grand strategy. And I worry a lot about the instability of the nuclear world in the decade ahead.
I think we only have time for one more question because we want to be able to get Garrett out to sign books for you all. So if you have questions after this one, he will be happy to answer questions while he's signing books too.
When you announced that you had some interviews of some people in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, I'm hoping you can give me some insight, not interviews, but histories, insights on something that's been puzzling me for 60 plus years. My father did not talk about it, and that is how the people in those cities felt about us, or what had descended upon them. My father was had put on his dress whites, sent into Nagasaki a few days after the war, after the bombing, and then interacted with some people, and they gave him some gifts. The Sakamoto family make a charcoal drawing of my dad and give it to him. That just seems incomprehensible to me compared to what happened. And do you have any thoughts that we share there?
Yeah, obviously it's an enormously complex question. There are very mixed feelings in a lot of different directions by the Japanese about the atomic bombings. Some of it stems from the American occupation, where we suppressed discussion or publishing on the bombing for years in Japan. There's a fabulous book by a woman named Leslie Bloom called Fallout that is sort of the story of John Hersey writing that famous New Yorker piece about Hiroshima, and sort of all of the efforts by the US to cover up and block reporting on the extent of the atomic bombings and the extent of radiation poisoning afterward. I think my experience is traveling there, both cities feel an immense level of responsibility to ensure that their cities are the last hit by an atomic bomb. The mayor of Hiroshima still sends a letter to the president of any country that sets off a nuclear weapon in a test. Every single time a nuclear test is conducted in the world. Writing about these weapons are terrible, they should never be used. Let me tell you our experience here in Hiroshima. And one of the things I really wanted to do with this book was, along with the greatest generation here, that generation is passing quickly in Japan. And it's going to be up to us to carry forward their legacy and dream that they are the last atomic bomb survivors in the world. And I hope that that's a mission that in this next generation we can carry forward as thoroughly and passionately as they've carried it forward in the 80 years since the bombings.
Graff, thank you so, so much.
Yes, thank you very much, Brooke and Garrett, for a very interesting and insightful program. And to you, the audience, as well, for your many good questions, which always adds a lot to our program, so we really appreciate that. And now we'll adjourn for a reception and book signing in the lobby, where you can continue this the discussion with Garrett. And thanks again for joining us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you back at the Ford Library for our future programs. Thank you again. Good night.